The moment Rusk Thornhelm hit the ground, the entire arena fell into a silence that felt heavier than steel. Moments ago, the crowd had been roaring, beer sloshing over the rails, the air thick with the scent of dust and adrenaline. But now, the only sound was the slow, thunderous breathing of Hellspark, the notorious bull that had just sent Rusk flying like a rag doll. The cowboy lay motionless in the dirt, his hat tossed a few feet away, his chest barely moving. In that moment, no one knew if they were witnessing the end of a legend or something much stranger. Rusk wasn't a young man anymore. At 42, he carried the weight of decades in the ring, and even heavier ghosts outside of it. Folks knew him as tough, proud, and a little too stubborn for his own good. He had promised his little girl, Emma, that last year would be his final ride. But the pull of the arena, the lights, the roar, it was too much. Maybe he was chasing glory. Maybe he was running from something. Either way, Hellspark didn't care. The bull had launched Rusk into the air with such force that it knocked the wind out of everyone watching. Time slowed as his body flipped and crumpled onto the dirt. Medics hesitated. Even the rodeo clown seemed unsure. And then Hellspark stopped. Instead of trampling the downed cowboy, the bull slowly stepped forward, towering over Rusk's still body. Dust swirled around them like smoke from a fire. The crowd leaned in, hearts pounding. Some removed their hats. Others whispered prayers. Hellspark sniffed Rusk's face, his hot breath sending ripples through the dust, and didn't move. Number. Snorting, no stomping. Just stillness. It was like the beast had changed, as if something inside him recognized the man he had just taken down. The scene didn't make sense, but no one could look away. In the stands, Emma Thornhelm gripped her grandmother's hand. She was just 10, her eyes wide and wet. She didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She just stared, lips trembling, whispering under her breath, "Get up, Daddy." And then, almost like an answer to her words, Rusk's right hand twitched, barely, but enough to bring a gasp from the crowd. Rusk Thornhelm was still alive, but something inside him had shifted, something deeper than bone or blood. What came next wouldn't be a comeback. It would be a reckoning, and it would uncover truths buried far deeper than the dust that now covered his face. The E in Holleridge Regional was a small, dim-lit space never built to handle major trauma. Yet on that evening, every light blazed and every nurse moved. As if fighting time itself, Dr. Vexler Drownfield stood at the center, sweat forming at his temples. He'd seen broken ribs, concussions, and more than a few collapsed lungs in his 27 years here. But this was different. Rusk Thornhelm was more than just another patient. He was a piece of the town's soul, and more personally, a man Vexler had once called a brother. Rusk lay unconscious, a tangle of bruises, torn muscles, and hair matted with arena dust. Machines beeped in uneven rhythm, and Vexler kept glancing at the vitals as if willing them into normalcy. "How the hell are you still breathing?" he muttered under his breath. But he already knew. Rusk was a fighter, stubborn, reckless, relentless. What worried Vexler more wasn't the physical damage. It was something deeper. Something he saw in the scans but couldn't yet explain. The nurses left the room to give him a moment alone. Vexler pulled a chair close and sat down beside the bed. "You shouldn't have climbed back on that bull, Rusk," he whispered. "You were supposed to walk away. You promised her." He didn't say Emma's name aloud. He didn't need to. The guilt sat heavy between them, even with Rusk unconscious. Years ago, when Rusk's wife died, Vexler had promised to keep an eye on the family. But promises fade when pride and silence take their place. The memory stung. Vexler had been there. When Rusk won his first championship, he'd patched him up after dozens of falls. But they hadn't spoken properly in nearly 5 years. Not since the night Rusk accused him of hiding something after his wife's death. That night had ended with fists and silence. Two men with two. Much pain and too few words. He stood to check the monitor again. And there it was. A spike in brain activity brief, but sharp. Vexler leaned in. "You're hearing me, aren't you?" he said, more to himself than to Rusk. The machine pulsed again. It wasn't coincidence. Something was waking up. And deep. Inside, Vexler felt a creeping fear. That Rusk's fall had unlocked more than trauma. Maybe a memory. Or a truth neither of them was ready to face. Outside the room, Emma sat curled in a plastic chair, staring at the door. When Vexler stepped out to talk to her, he paused. The words caught in his throat. Because suddenly, he remembered something. He had buried long ago something about Rusk's wife. And he realized if Rusk survived this, he would have to tell him the truth. The dust on the roadside hadn't settled when Calderon Shadewick stepped out of his faded black truck. His boots hit the gravel with a thud that echoed through the empty parking lot of Rusty Spur Tavern, the same bar where rodeo legends were born and reputations buried. He hadn't set foot in Holleridge in almost 8 years, not since that night with Rusk, the championship, and the fallout that followed. But now the past was clawing its way back. Word of Rusk Thornhelm's accident had traveled fast, and Calderon wasn't the kind of man to ignore unfinished business. Inside the bar, eyes turned as soon as he entered. Some recognized him immediately. Others whispered. He looked older. Sure, more lined around the eyes, slower in the shoulders. But that steel gaze was still there. He ordered a whiskey, neat, and sat in the same booth he had all those years ago. The room buzzed with tension. Rusk's name hung in the air like smoke, and Calderon knew. Sooner or later, someone would ask what he was doing back. He didn't have a good answer, at least not one he was ready to say out loud. Truth was, guilt had gnawed at him for years. That final ride back when he and Rusk were neck and neck for the national title was supposed to end differently. Rusk had lost more than a trophy that year. He'd lost trust. And Calderon had never cleared his name. Now, as Rusk lay in a hospital bed, Calderon wondered if this was fate giving him a second shot or a trap waiting to close. The door creaked open behind him. It was Wade, one of Rusk's old friends. He looked tired, worn from sleepless nights at the hospital. "You got some nerve coming back here," Wade said, sitting across from him without invitation. Calderon met his stare but said nothing. "He's not dead, you know? Not yet." Wade's voice cracked slightly. "You should leave before he wakes up and sees your damn face." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Calderon finally said. "I just needed to see it for myself. And maybe fix something that's been broken too long." The silence that followed wasn't forgiving. But Wade didn't walk away. Back at the hospital, Rusk's eyes fluttered for the first time since the fall. The machines beeped faster. And somewhere deep in his fogged mind, a name rose to the surface: Calderon. His hand twitched. His breath hitched. Something inside him was stirring. And it wasn't just the pain. It was memory and resentment. The cabin sat at the edge of Holleridge, half swallowed by weeds and rusted tools. Most folks assumed Braylock had left town or drank himself out of it. But he was still there, tucked behind broken blinds and layers of silence. Once, he was one of the best rodeo trainers in the Southwest. Now, he was a ghost with a whiskey bottle and too many memories. When he heard about Rusk Thornhelm's fall, he didn't turn on the TV. He just stared at the radio as the news replayed like a funeral hymn. Braylock hadn't spoken to Rusk in over a decade. Not since that spring when things went wrong, really. Wrong. He still remembered the last training session, the argument, the threats. Rusk had blamed him for a decision that changed everything. And maybe he was right. Braylock never defended himself. He just walked away and let time eat the truth. But now, with Rusk lying between life and death, those old ghosts were clawing at the door. He opened a rusted trunk beneath his bed, the hinges creaking like bones. Inside was a stack of old rodeo patches, a broken stopwatch, and a manila envelope he hadn't touched in years. Written across the top in shaky black marker, Thornhelm, confidential. His hands trembled as he pulled it out. Inside were photos, letters, and something more valuable than either a signed medical clearance from over 10 years ago. One that had been forged. Braylock had never told anyone. Not even Calderon. Not even Rusk. But now he felt the clock ticking. If Rusk woke up, this secret would matter more than ever. Because that document wasn't just a lie. It was the reason Rusk had stayed in the game long after his body should have. Quit. And Braylock, he was the one who let it happen. He looked at his reflection in the dusty mirror-gray beard, sunken eyes, a man weathered by regret. He hadn't coached since that day, and he told himself it was punishment. But deep down, he knew it was fear. Fear of facing the boy he once believed in, the boy he helped break. And now, that boy was a man lying broken in a hospital bed, while Braylock held the last piece of truth. With a heavy breath, he grabbed his coat and the envelope. For the first time in years, he stepped out into the morning light. He didn't know what he'd say when he got there. But one thing was certain Rusk deserved to know, even if it shattered what little trust remained between them. He hadn't planned on stopping in Holleridge. Zeebrick Hollowpine never stayed anywhere long, enough for people to ask questions. His face was weathered by sun and silence, and his boots looked like they'd walked through more pasts and futures. But something about the rodeo that day had pulled him in, something he couldn't name. He didn't cheer, didn't clap. He just sat on the edge of the bleachers, hands folded, eyes fixed on one rider, Rusk Thornhelm. When Rusk fell, Zeebrick didn't flinch like the others. He stood slowly, calmly, while the crowd gasped and the medics rushed in. His gaze lingered on the bull, Hellspark, watching the animal not with fear, but familiarity. And when the bull lowered its head to Rusk's face instead of finishing the job, Zeebrick narrowed his eyes. So it begins, he whispered to himself, though no one was close enough to hear. Zeb Rick had seen bulls break men before, bones snapping like branches. Lives ended in seconds. But this moment was different. He'd witnessed that stillness once before, decades ago, in another town, with another rider. It had haunted him ever since. Now, standing among strangers in cowboy hats and dusty boots, he felt the chill of recognition. This wasn't just another rodeo. This was something deeper, older, and unfinished. He waited until the crowd cleared, then made his way quietly around the back of the arena. He wasn't looking for autographs or attention. He was looking for answers, or maybe confirmation of a suspicion that had gnawed at him for years. In his back pocket was an old photograph, folded and faded. It showed a younger Rusk, maybe 20, beside a different bull, one that looked almost identical to Hellspark. But the date on the photo was from before that bull was even born. Zeebrick walked into the hospital later that evening, claiming to be a family friend. No one questioned him. In small towns, quiet men with dusty coats usually went unnoticed. He found Rusk's room, stood outside the glass, and watched the machines beat beside him. Rusk was still out cold, but his fingers twitched again. The same twitch Zeebrick had seen on that rider years ago, right before he disappeared. Something was happening. Something no one else saw coming. Zeebrick felt it in his bones. And he knew before this was over, he'd have to break a silence he'd kept for over 20 years. One that tied him to Rusk in ways neither man fully understood yet. Craven. Dustmark had built his career on stories that other people wanted. Buried. He wasn't flashy, didn't wear a press badge, and didn't care for approval. But he listened, and more importantly, he remembered. And when the name Rusk Thornhelm exploded across the local news after the rodeo incident, Craven's instincts kicked in. There was something in the way people talked about that fall. Like it wasn't just an accident. Like something was being carefully left out. His office above the Holleridge Gazette was a mess of old files, dust-covered typewriters, and notebooks stacked to the ceiling. He flipped through a folder he hadn't opened in years, one labeled Thornhelm. Our inside were clippings from the early 2000s. Championship wins, sponsorship deals, but also rumors. Unconfirmed injuries. Medical clearances that didn't match timelines. One article from 2008 caught his eye. A small paragraph about a mysterious trainer leaving town overnight. The name wasn't printed, but Craven knew it was Braylock. The deeper he looked, the stranger it all became. Hellspark, the bull that nearly killed Rusk, had only been on the circuit for a few years. But Craven found a photo in an old Rodeo magazine from 1999 that showed a bull with nearly identical markings. Different name, same eyes. The article was from another state, another town. And standing near that bull was a much younger Rusk. It made no sense, unless it wasn't just about the bull. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Craven lit a cigarette and stared out his window at the hospital down the road. Something about this whole thing felt more personal than professional. He remembered watching Rusk ride as a teenager, how he made the crowd go quiet with one hand in the air and a storm in his eyes. He was more than a cowboy. He was a symbol. And now he was broken, or waking up. Either way, the story wasn't over. It was just starting. He grabbed his tape recorder and headed toward the hospital, but not to interview doctors or nurses. He wanted to find Zebrick Holopine, the man he'd seen slipping quietly out of the rodeo stands that day. He recognized him instantly. Zebrick had been involved in a story years ago that Craven had chased and lost. A story about a missing rider and a bull no one could trace. Now it was all circling back. As Craven stepped into the hospital lobby, he felt the buzz in the air, like something about to break. He didn't have the full picture yet, but he had the thread. And if he pulled hard enough, the whole thing would unravel, including the truth Rusk Thornhelm might not be ready to face. The office behind the rodeo arena hadn't changed in years. Same trophy cases, same yellowing posters, same framed photo of the 2009 championship lineup. Orrin Gravebrush stood in front of that photo now, staring at the young men in it back when they all believed they were invincible. He and Rusk Thornhelm stood side by side in that image, smiling like brothers. But time had cracked that friendship wide open. And now, Rusk lay in a hospital bed, and Orrin's reflection looked back at him like a stranger. Orrin had been the head judge the day Rusk rode Hellspark. He'd signed the waiver, approved the bull, and given the green light for a ride he knew should never have happened. Rusk's body wasn't ready. His mind wasn't clear. But Orrin had told himself it wasn't his call. Still, he felt it. That gut twist when Rusk climbed the chute. And when the gate burst open, Orrin knew he had just watched his oldest friend step into something he might not walk away from. He hadn't visited the hospital. Not yet. Maybe it was shame, maybe fear, but mostly it was guilt. They hadn't spoken in 6 years, ever since the fallout over the injury cover-up. Rusk blamed Braylock, but Orrin knew the truth. The forged document had passed across his desk too, and he had signed it. Quietly, without protest, because Rusk wanted to ride and Orrin didn't want to be the one to tell him no. A knock on the door pulled him out of the past. It was Craven Dustmark, the reporter. His eyes were sharp, like a man who already knew too much. "You got a minute?" Craven asked. Orrin hesitated but nodded. The two men sat across from each other in silence before Craven finally spoke. "I'm not here for gossip, Judge. I'm here because I think this town is hiding something. And it starts with you, Braylick, and that damn bull." Oren didn't deny it. He just looked at the photo again. "Rusk was always meant to go further than the rest of us," he said quietly, "and we were too damn scared to stop him." Craven leaned forward. "So help me uncover the rest, before someone else gets hurt." Oren looked down at his calloused hands, then reached into a locked drawer, pulling out an envelope labeled Hellspark Origin File. He placed it on the desk between them. "You didn't hear this from me," he muttered. But in his gut, Oren knew it was too late for secrets. The past was already pushing through the surface, and whatever was buried in that file was going to bring the truth crashing down on them all. No one really knew Thrennen Blackworts. He wasn't the kind of man who showed up at rodeos to smile for cameras or shake hands. He stayed in the shadows, collecting his winnings in silence, vanishing before the dust had even settled. But when Rusk Thornhelm's accident hit the news, Thrennen didn't disappear. For the first time in years, he returned to Holleridge not for business, but because the past had finally caught up to him. He sat alone in the back room of his ranch house, staring at a worn photo in his hand. It was old and creased, showing a younger Rusk with his arm around a teenage bull calf barely recognizable as Hellspark. Back then, the bull's name had been Midnight Sun, and it had belonged to someone else entirely. Someone Thrennen had loved more than life itself. His brother, Gavin Blackworts. Gavin had been the original rider, the first to try breaking Midnight Sun. He believed the bull was more than just an animal. He called him a mirror something that reflected a man's soul in motion. But Gavin died in the arena with that bull under him. No one ever found out why the gate malfunctioned or how the bull escaped containment. Official reports were vague, but Thrennen knew. And in his grief, he did something unthinkable. He took the bull, renamed him Hellspark, and spent years breeding him in secret, refining his fury, training him for revenge. When Rusk unknowingly requested to ride Hellspark, Thrennen didn't interfere. Part of him wanted justice. Another part wanted to see if the bull would remember. And when he watched the footage, how Hellspark stopped instead of stomping, how the beast bowed his head, something inside Thrennen broke. The bull hadn't acted out of rage. It had acted out of recognition. Now, with reporters closing in and Rusk fighting for his life, Thrennen knew the truth couldn't stay buried. He opened a drawer and pulled out Gavin's journal pages of handwritten thoughts, sketches of Midnight Sun, and one entry circled in red ink. "The bull is loyal to something deeper than fear. He knows who we are." Thrennen ran his thumb over the words and felt the weight of every year he had spent in silence. He stood, grabbed the journal, and headed toward his truck. If Rusk survived, he deserved to know everything. About the bull, about Gavin, about why that ride was never just about pride, but about fate, legacy, and a shared sorrow neither man had ever understood until now. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath Malric Crowshade as he walked down the center aisle of the tiny church in Holleridge. He'd lit the candles himself that morning. No service, no congregation, just silence and memory. The place smelled like old hymnals and cedar polish. It wasn't grand, but it was steady, like Malric himself. He'd been the town pastor for nearly 30 years. Married people, buried people, held hands when hope ran thin. But today, he lit candles for one man, Rusk Thornhelm. Malric had baptized Rusk as a boy. He'd watched him grow from wild teenager to local legend to distant stranger. And now, lying in a hospital bed somewhere between life and death, Rusk was back in everyone's prayers, even those too proud to say them out loud. But it wasn't Rusk who walked through the church doors that morning. It was Emma, his daughter, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear and looking older than her 10 years. She didn't speak at first, just sat in the front pew, legs swinging, eyes wide and searching. Malric joined her without saying a word, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the wind through the stained glass windows. "Is my daddy gonna die?" she asked. Malric didn't lie. He never did. "I don't know," he said softly, "but I know he's still fighting, and sometimes that's enough for today." They sat there a long while. Emma asked questions between tears about heaven, about bulls, about why people hurt even when they don't mean to. Malric answered as best he could, not with fancy words or scripture, but with honesty. "Some folks carry pain so long they forget how to put it down," he said. "Your daddy, he's been carrying more than most." Emma nodded, wiping her nose with her sleeve. Before she left, Malric handed her a small leather-bound book. Inside was a handwritten note. "Faith isn't knowing the ending. It's walking forward anyway." She held it tight to her chest as she walked back out into the sunlight. Malric watched her go, feeling the weight of her small courage, heavier than most men's. That night, he returned to the church alone. One candle still burned on the altar. He sat beneath the cross and whispered a prayer, not for miracles, but for mercy. For Rusk, for Emma, for everyone tangled in this knot of past and pain. Because deep in his bones, Malric knew something was coming, a reckoning, a revelation. And when it arrived, not everyone would leave it. Hold out the knock on the hospital. Room door came just after sunrise. Jarnell Bleakthorn stepped inside slowly, removing his hat as he entered. His presence was quiet, respectful, but weighted like a storm held behind his eyes. Rusk Thornhelm lay awake now, propped against a pillow, pale but alert. The room had grown still since the nurses left, but when Jarnell walked in, it felt like time itself held its breath. Rusk recognized him instantly, though they hadn't spoken in over 20 years. "Didn't think I'd ever see your face again," Rusk said hoarsely. Jarnell nodded. "I wasn't sure you should." His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. In them, he held an old envelope sealed in wax. It had once belonged to Gavin Blackquartz, the fallen rider, the brother of Thrennan, and someone Rusk had quietly admired as a teenager. Jarnell had been Gavin's closest friend and the last person to speak with him before the fatal ride. For years, he had blamed himself for not stopping Gavin from riding that bull, then known as Midnight Sun. And after Gavin's death, he'd vanished from the rodeo world entirely, haunted by guilt. But he had also taken something with him, Gavin's final letter. A letter written not to Thrennan, but to Rusk. "I was supposed to give you this a long time ago," Jarnell said, setting the envelope on Rusk's bedside table. "But I didn't think you were ready. Truth is, maybe I wasn't ready either." Rusk stared at it, heart thudding. His fingers shook as he broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with time, written in Gavin's handwriting. Familiar, careful, personal. The letter spoke of legacy, of the weight men carry into the arena, of the fear they pretend doesn't exist. Gavin had seen something in Rusk that no one else did, not just talent, but heart. "You're more than a rider," the letter said. "You're a bridge between pain and purpose. One day, the bull won't be your enemy. It'll be your reflection." Rusk felt the tears come, uninvited but welcome. For the first time in years, something inside him loosened. Jarnell stood to leave. "There's nothing left to hide now," he said gently. "Make peace with it, for yourself, and for her." He nodded toward the window, where Emma stood outside with Malric, watching the sunrise. Rusk looked at her, then at the letter, and exhaled deeply. The past had broken him, but now it had also freed him. Whatever came next, forgiveness, healing, or just one more day, he would face it not as the rider he used to be, but as the man he was finally becoming.